The divorce cost Audrey Sterling more than just money. It cost her identity. She stood in that courtroom and watched the husband she built an empire with strip her of every dollar, every friend, and every ounce of dignity. He believed that leaving her penniless in a studio apartment was his ultimate victory. But he forgot that power isn't always tied to a bank account. Sometimes it's tied to the company you keep. When he saw who opened the door of that Gulfstream G650ER, the look on his face was worth more than the millions he stole. The fluorescent lights of the Manhattan Civil Courthouse hummed with a sound that felt like a drill pressing directly into Audrey's temple. It was the sound of her life dismantling one billable hour at a time. Across the mahogany table sat Richard Sterling. He wasn't looking at her. He was checking his watch, a Patek Philippe Nautilus that Audrey had bought him for their 10th anniversary. He adjusted the cuff of his bespoke Brioni suit, the fabric shimmering slightly under the sterile lights. He looked bored. That was the worst part. He wasn't angry. He was just inconvenienced. To his right sat a woman Audrey had only known as the Shark until 3 months ago. Linda Kressler, the kind of divorce attorney who didn't just win cases, she salted the earth afterwards, so nothing could ever grow again. Mrs. Sterling. Judge Holloway said, his voice weary. He peered over his spectacles, looking at the stack of documents that represented 20 years of Audrey's life. Your counsel has argued for an equitable distribution of the Sterling hedge fund assets based on your early contributions to the firm's founding. However, Audrey's hands were trembling beneath the table. She clasped them together, digging her fingernails into her palms until it stung just to ground herself. Don't cry, she told herself. Do not let him see you cry. However, the judge continued, the prenuptial agreement signed in 2004 is ironclad. Furthermore, the forensic accounting provided by Mr. Sterling's team clearly shows that the contributions you cite were administrative in nature and do not entitle you to equity stakes in the current portfolio. Administrative. Audrey felt the air leave her lungs. Administrative. She remembered 2004. She remembered the nights in their cramped apartment in Queens. Richard crying on the floor because he'd lost his first investor. She remembered taking her inheritance from her grandmother, the only money she had in the world, and writing a check to keep the lights on. She remembered typing the pitch decks because Richard was too dyslexic to spell-check them himself. She remembered charming the investors at dinners she cooked herself because they couldn't afford catering. Administrative, Audrey whispered. Excuse me, the judge asked. Audrey's lawyer, a court-appointed junior associate named Ben, who looked like he hadn't slept in a week, touched her arm. Audrey, don't, he hissed. Richard finally looked up. He offered a small, pitying smile. It was the smile one gives to a confused child. I am ruling in favor of the plaintiff, Richard Sterling. Judge Holloway slammed the gavel. The sound cracked through the room like a gunshot. The primary residence in the Hamptons, the penthouse on 57th Street, and the liquid assets remain the sole property of Mr. Sterling. Mrs. Sterling is awarded a one-time spousal support payment of $50,000 as stipulated in the 2004 agreement. $50,000. The Sterling Fund was worth $4 billion. This is insane. Ben stood up, his papers scattering. Your Honor, my client has no home to go to $50,000 in New York City, is exactly what she agreed to. Linda Kressler cut in her voice smooth as silk. She snapped her briefcase shut. Thank you, Your Honor. The proceedings were over. Just like that. 2 decades erased in 20 minutes, Audrey stood up. Her legs felt like lead. She turned to leave, but Richard was already standing in the aisle blocking her path. He smelled like sandalwood and victory. "I'm being generous, Ord," Richard said, quietly, loud enough only for her to hear. "I could have fought the 50 grand, too. But I'm not a monster." Audrey looked into the eyes of the man she had nursed through the flu, the man she had held when his father died, the man she had built a kingdom for. "You erased me, Richard. You erased me from the history of our own life." Richard chuckled a dry, hollow sound. "You were a good support system, Audrey. But let's be real. You were the scaffolding. Once the building is up, the scaffolding comes down. You're just in the way of the view now." He leaned in closer. "Isabella doesn't like the scaffolding." Isabella. The 24-year-old PR intern. The one who was now living in the Hamptons house Audrey had decorated with her own hands. "Enjoy the check," Richard said, patting her shoulder. "Don't spend it all in one place." He walked out flanked by his legal team, looking like a king departing his throne room. Audrey stood alone in the center of the courtroom. The silence was deafening. She walked out into the hallway, numb. She reached into her purse for her phone, but her hand brushed against something else. The old, worn leather diary she had carried since college. She pulled it out. Inside wasn't a diary of feelings. It was a contact book. It was filled with names from before Richard. Names from a life she had abandoned to be Richard's wife. Names she hadn't spoken in 20 years because Richard was intimidated by them. He had made her cut them off. "They're too arrogant, Ord. They make me feel small. If you love me, you'll focus on us." She opened the book to the letter S. Her finger traced a name written in faded blue ink. Sebastian. She stared at it for a long moment. Then she closed the book, shoved it back into her bag, and walked out into the pouring New York rain. She wasn't ready yet, but she wouldn't be the scaffolding forever. 6 months later, the smell of stale bear and fried grease was something you never truly got out of your hair. Audrey scrubbed her scalp in the tiny, cracked porcelain sink of her studio apartment in Weehawken, New Jersey, but the scent lingered. This was her life now. The $50,000 was gone. $12,000 to pay off credit card debt Richard had secretly racked up in her name before the divorce, a final "screw you" that his lawyers had skillfully pinned on her. $15,000 for the first and last month's rent and security deposit on this shoebox apartment. The rest had bled away on legal fees trying to appeal the verdict, an effort that had failed spectacularly 2 weeks ago. Now Audrey Sterling, former co-founder of a billion-dollar hedge fund, was a waitress at Benny's Bar and Grill. A dive bar where the regulars tipped in lottery tickets and unwanted advice. She dried her hair with a towel that was starting to fray. She looked in the mirror. She looked tired. The lines around her eyes were deeper. Her hair, once professionally colored, a rich chestnut, was now showing streaks of gray she couldn't afford to hide. Buzz. Her phone lit up on the counter. It was a news alert. She had tried to turn them off, but the algorithm knew what she clicked on. Sterling merger imminent. Richard Sterling to acquire Vane Industries in hostile takeover. Rumors swirl of a massive gala to announce the deal. Audrey froze. Vane Industries. She felt a cold shiver run down her spine. Richard wasn't just content with his own empire. Now he was trying to devour the very giants he used to fear. And he was doing it the dirty way. A hostile takeover meant he was leveraging debt, buying up shares through shell companies, and forcing the board to sell. It was Richard's signature move, brute force, disguised as business strategy. There was a knock at her door. A heavy, aggressive knock. Audrey frowned. She wasn't expecting anyone. She tightened her robe and walked to the door, peeking through the peephole. Her heart stopped. It was Richard. And he wasn't alone. Isabella was with him, wearing a white trench coat that probably cost more than Audrey's entire apartment building. Audrey unlocked the deadbolt and opened the door a crack. "What are you doing here?" Richard pushed the door open, forcing Audrey to step back. He stepped into her tiny living room, which was also her bedroom and her kitchen, and looked around with a sneer of disgust. "Charming," Richard said, kicking a stray shoe aside. "Very rustic." "Get out, Richard," Audrey said, her voice shaking. "I have a shift in an hour." "Oh, we won't keep you from your career," Isabella giggled. She clung to Richard's arm, looking at Audrey like she was a zoo animal. "I needed you to sign this," Richard said, pulling a document from his jacket. "It's a release form. We're selling the lake house in Como. Since your name is technically still on the deed from the original purchase in '99, the Italian authorities are being sticky about it. I need your signature to liquidate it. The Como house." Audrey felt a lump in her throat. That was the one place she had loved. She had restored it. It was where they had planned to retire. "You're selling it?" "Isabella finds it a bit drafty." Richard shrugged. "We want something in Saint-Tropez. Sign it, Audrey. I'll give you $1,000 for the trouble. God knows you look like you need it." He pulled out a checkbook. He actually pulled out a checkbook. Audrey looked at the pen he was holding out. She looked at Isabella, who was checking her reflection in the microwave door. She looked at Richard, the man who had taken her youth, her ideas and her love, and turned them into cash for himself. Something inside Audrey snapped. Not a loud snap. A quiet, terrifying click. "No," she said. Richard paused. "Excuse me." "No," Audrey said louder this time. She didn't take the pen. "I'm not signing it." Richard's face darkened. The charm evaporated. "Don't be stupid, Audrey. You can't afford a lawyer to fight me on this. If you don't sign, I'll sue you for obstruction. I'll bury you in legal fees until you're living on the street instead of this dump." "Get out," Audrey said. She walked to the door and held it open. Richard laughed a harsh bark. "You think you have leverage. You have nothing. You are a middle-aged waitress living in New Jersey. I'm about to buy Vane Industries. I am a king. You are a ghost." He threw the papers on her small dining table. "I'll have a courier pick them up tomorrow. Sign them or I destroy you. Again." He grabbed Isabella's hand and stormed out. Audrey slammed the door. She leaned her back against it, sliding down until she hit the floor. She hugged her knees to her chest. Vane Industries. Richard was going to buy Vane Industries. She looked at the papers on the table. Then she looked at her purse, where the old diary sat. She crawled over to her bag. Her hands were steady now. The fear was gone, replaced by a cold, calculating rage. She opened the diary to the letter S. She picked up her phone. She dialed the number. It was an international number. She didn't know if it would still work. It had been 22 years. Ring, ring, ring. "This is the private line of Sebastian Vane." A voice answered. It wasn't a secretary. It was him. His voice was deeper, rougher, but it was him. "Who is this?" Audrey took a breath. "Hello, Sebastian," she said. "It's Audrey." There was a silence on the other end, a silence that stretched for 10 seconds. "Audrey Sterling," he asked, his tone unreadable. "Audrey Calloway," she corrected him. "I need to talk to you about your company, and I need to talk to you about a man named Richard." "Where are you?" Sebastian asked immediately. The authority in his voice was instant. "I'm in New Jersey." "Not anymore," Sebastian said. "Pack a bag. I'm sending the jet to Teterboro. Be there in an hour." "Sebastian, I can't." "Audrey." He cut her off. His voice softened just a fraction. "You saved my life in Oxford. I told you, if you ever called, I would answer. I'm answering. Get to the airport." The line went dead. Audrey looked at the phone. She looked at the waitress uniform hanging on the door. She walked over, took the uniform, and dropped it in the trash can. She wasn't the scaffolding anymore. She was the demolition crew. The rain had turned into a sleet that stung the skin, but Audrey barely felt it. She stood outside the FBO fixed base operator at Teterboro Airport, clutching a small duffel bag. It contained 2 pairs of jeans, a sweater, and the only formal dress she had managed to save from the estate sale, a simple black cocktail dress. She felt ridiculous. A part of her expected a prank, a taxi to nowhere. But then the lights pierced the gloom. A sleek black car, a Maybach S680, rolled onto the tarmac, bypassing security entirely. It stopped in front of her. The driver, a mountain of a man with a jagged scar on his chin, stepped out and opened the rear door. "Miss Calloway?" he asked. "Not Mrs. Sterling." "Yes." "Mr. Vane is waiting on the Bird. Please." He drove her 300 yards across the tarmac to where the beast sat. It wasn't just a jet. It was a Bombardier Global 7500, the Rolls-Royce of the skies. It was painted a matte midnight blue, almost black, with no tail number visible to the naked eye, a ghost plane. Audrey walked up the stairs. The interior smelled of rich leather and aged scotch. Sitting in a club chair at the far end, illuminated by a single reading light, was Sebastian Vane. He looked different than the boy she had known at Oxford University. The boy she knew was lanky, brilliant and reckless, the heir to a shipping fortune, who tried to drink himself to death to spite his father. The man sitting here was made of steel. His hair was silver at the temples, cut sharp. He wore a charcoal suit without a tie, the collar open. His eyes, the color of stormy seas, locked onto hers. He didn't smile. He stood up. He was taller than she remembered. "Audrey," he said. "Sebastian?" She breathed. He walked over and stopped a foot away from her. He looked her up and down, noting the frayed coat, the tired eyes, the tension in her shoulders. His jaw tightened. "He did a number on you," Sebastian said softly. It wasn't an insult. It was an observation of damage, like inspecting a car crash. "I lost everything," Audrey admitted. The tears threatened to come again, but she held them back. "He took the house, the money, the friends. Now he's trying to take your company." "I know," Sebastian said. He gestured for her to sit. "Richard Sterling has been buying up debt on my logistics division for 6 months. He thinks I'm bleeding. He thinks Vane Industries is a wounded animal waiting to be put down." Audrey sat down, sinking into the cream leather seat. "Is it—" Sebastian poured 2 glasses of amber liquid from a crystal decanter. He handed one to her. "Drink. It's Macallan 25. You look like you need it." She took a sip. The warmth hit her chest instantly. "Vane Industries is in transition," Sebastian admitted, sitting opposite her. "We are pivoting to green energy logistics. It's expensive. Our cash flow is down. Richard smelled blood. He wants to buy us, strip the assets fire, 40,000 employees, and sell the parts for profit. He calls it optimization." "He calls it winning," Audrey said bitterly. "He needs this deal, Sebastian. His own fund is over-leveraged. He's betting everything on acquiring you. If he doesn't close this deal, his investors will panic. He's vulnerable. He just doesn't know it." Sebastian studied her. "And how do you know this?" "Because I wrote his algorithms," Audrey said. Sebastian's eyebrows shot up. "Richard is the face." Audrey continued, her voice gaining strength. "He's the salesman, but the risk management models. The hedging strategies, I wrote them in 2005. I updated them every Sunday night for 15 years while he watched football. I know where the bodies are buried, Sebastian. I know that his Administrative work was actually me running the quantitative side of the business. Sebastian leaned back, a slow smile spreading across his face. It was a dangerous smile. So you know the weak spot in his armor. I created the armor, Audrey corrected him, and I know exactly where the chink is. Why come to me? Sebastian asked. Why now? Because he came to my house today. Audrey said, her eyes hardening. He brought his mistress. He laughed at me. He tried to bully me into signing away the last thing I had. He thinks I'm nothing. I want to show him I'm not. Sebastian swirled his drink. The annual Global Finance Gala is in 3 days, in London. Everyone will be there. The heads of the World Bank, the Royals, and Richard Sterling. He plans to announce the hostile takeover of Vane Industries publicly at the event. He wants to humiliate me on the world stage. He loves a show, Audrey nodded. Then let's give him a show, Sebastian said. He pressed a button on the side of his chair. A flight attendant appeared instantly. Yes, Mr. Vane. Prepare the guest suite for Miss Calloway and call my styling team in London. Tell them to clear their schedule. We have work to do. He turned back to Audrey. You said you lost everything, Audrey. That's good. Why is that good? Because a person with nothing to lose is the most dangerous person in the room. Sebastian clinked his glass against hers. Welcome to the board of directors, Audrey. The engines roared to life. The G7500 began to taxi. Audrey looked out the window as the lights of New Jersey faded away. She wasn't running away. She was gathering ammunition. London was grey, but it was the colour of old money, not despair. The penthouse suite of the Claridge's Hotel had been transformed into a command centre. Servers were humming in the corner, cooling fans spinning as they crunched terabytes of data. 3 junior analysts from Vane Industries, sharp kids from Cambridge, and LSE were typing furiously on laptops. But the centre of gravity in the room was Audrey. She stood before a whiteboard, covered in complex mathematical formulas. She was wearing a silk robe provided by the hotel, her hair still wet from the shower, but her eyes were razor sharp. Stop, Audrey said, pointing a marker at one of the analysts. Go back to the Q3 liquidity ratios for Sterling Global. The analyst, a young man named Pierce, looked nervous. Ms. Calloway, the public filings show a 14% liquidity buffer. Richard is safe. He has the cash to execute the hostile takeover. That's what he wants the SEC to see, Audrey said, uncapping the marker. She drew a red line through the number. Richard doesn't keep his liquidity in cash. He keeps it in short-term commercial paper, specifically real estate bonds in Southeast Asia. Sebastian sat on the sofa watching her with an intensity that made the room feel smaller. He hadn't said a word for 20 minutes. He just watched her work. How do you know that? Pierce asked. Because in 2012, I set up that shell structure to avoid tax liability during the European debt crisis, Audrey said, her voice devoid of emotion. It was brilliant then, but it's a house of cards now. If the value of the Thai baht fluctuates by more than 3%, his liquidity evaporates. He's technically insolvent. The room went silent. He's not buying Vane Industries with cash, Audrey realized, turning to Sebastian. He's buying it with debt he can't back up. He's leveraging the idea of his wealth, not the reality of it. Sebastian stood up. He walked over to the whiteboard and looked at the equations Audrey had written the source code of her ex-husband's empire. Oh, Sebastian said, his voice low. If we expose that his collateral is worthless. The banks call the loans, Audrey finished. The stock plummets, the takeover bid fails, and Sterling Global collapses. We need proof, Sebastian said. I can get the proof, Audrey said, but I need access to his private server, the one he keeps offline. That's impossible, Pierce said. That requires a biometric key. Audrey smiled. It wasn't a nice smile. Richard is a creature of habit. He never changes his passwords because he thinks he's too smart to be hacked. But more importantly, the biometric key isn't just his fingerprint. It's voice recognition. And I have 20 years of home videos, Audrey said. I can synthesize his voice pass key in an hour. Sebastian looked at his team. Do it. Get her the raw audio files. As the analysts scrambled, Sebastian took Audrey's arm and led her into the adjoining dressing room. Inside, a team of stylists was waiting, racks of dresses, rows of shoes, and a table covered in diamonds worth more than a small country were arranged with military precision. We have the ammunition, Sebastian said, looking at the clothes. Now we need the armor. Sebastian, I can't, Audrey whispered, looking at a diamond necklace that glittered like ice. This is too much. I'm a waitress. I'm a scaffolding. Sebastian turned her around to face the floor-to-length mirror. He stood behind her, his hands hovering near her shoulders but not touching. Look at yourself, he commanded. Audrey looked. She saw a tired woman in a bathrobe. I see the woman who just dismantled a $4 billion hedge fund on a whiteboard in 10 minutes, Sebastian said. Richard didn't leave you because you were weak, Audrey. He left you because he knew that without him holding you back, you would eclipse him. You terrify him. He reached out and picked up a dress. It wasn't white. It wasn't a soft pastel. It was a deep blood-red velvet gown. Strapless. Structured. Dangerous. Wear this, Sebastian said. Tonight we don't just attend the gala. We go to war. Audrey reached out and touched the fabric. It felt like power. Okay, she whispered. And Audrey. Sebastian paused at the door. When we walk in, don't look at the floor. Look at him. Watch the light go out of his eyes. The flashbulbs were blinding. The annual Global Finance Gala was the Oscars of the banking world. The red carpet was a sea of black tuxedos and designer gowns. The air smelled of expensive perfume and desperate ambition. At the top of the stairs, holding court for a phalanx of reporters, was Richard Sterling. He looked impeccable. He was laughing, his head thrown back, holding a glass of champagne. Clinging to his arm was Isabella. She was wearing a sheer silver dress that left very little to the imagination. It was flashy. It screamed new money. Mr. Sterling, a reporter from the Financial Times shouted. Is it true that Sterling Global will be announcing the acquisition of Vane Industries tonight? Richard flashed a predatory grin. Let's just say that the landscape of global logistics is about to change. Vane Industries is a great historic brand, but it needs modern leadership. Is it a hostile takeover? Another reporter asked. It's a rescue mission, Richard corrected smoothly. Sebastian Vane is a relic. He's playing with windmills while the world demands efficiency. I'm doing him a favor. Isabella giggled. Richard is so generous that way. Inside the great hall, the atmosphere was electric. 2,000 of the world's wealthiest people were seated at round tables. The whispers were all about the takeover. Vane Industries was dead. Richard Sterling was the new emperor. Richard and Isabella took their seats at the head table, right next to the podium. He checked his phone. The stock price of Sterling Global was up 4% in after-hours trading on the rumors. He was richer than he had ever been. You look tense, babe, Isabella said, scrolling through Instagram on her phone under the table. Just adrenaline, Richard said, adjusting his tie. Tonight is the coronation. Once I announce the deal Vane is finished, I strip the assets, pay off my debts, and we buy that island in the Caribbean. The one with the pink sand, Isabella's eyes lit up. The very one. Suddenly the hum of conversation in the massive hall dropped. It didn't taper off. It was severed. Silence swept across the room like a wave starting from the massive double doors at the entrance and rushing toward the stage. Richard frowned. He turned around in his chair to see what was happening. The doors were thrown open. Walking in wasn't a celebrity. It wasn't a politician. It was Sebastian Vane. He looked calm, collected, and utterly unbothered by the rumors of his demise. He wore a tuxedo that fit so perfectly it looked like a second skin. But no one was looking at Sebastian. They were looking at the woman on his arm. She wore blood-red velvet that hugged every curve, pooling at her feet like liquid fire. Her hair, polished to a high shine, cascaded over one shoulder. Around her neck sat a diamond choker that caught the light and threw it back with a vengeance. She walked with a stride that ate up the ground, head high, shoulders back. Richard squinted. The woman looked familiar. She had the same height as Audrey. But Audrey was a frump. Audrey wore cardigans and worried about coupon expiration dates. This woman looked like she owned the building. The woman turned her head slightly as they walked down the center aisle. She locked eyes with Richard. She smiled. Richard's glass of champagne slipped from his fingers. It shattered on the floor, splashing expensive vintage brut onto Isabella's silver shoes. "Hey!" Isabella shrieked. Richard didn't hear her. He couldn't breathe. "Audrey," he mouthed. The word made no sound. The crowd parted for them. A whisper ran through the room. "Who is that? Is that the ex-wife I thought she was destitute?" Sebastian guided Audrey not to a table in the back, but to the table directly opposite Richard's. Table 1, the Vane Industries table. Audrey sat down, the red dress arranging itself like a throne. She looked across the 5 feet of space separating her from her ex-husband. Richard was pale. He grabbed a napkin and dabbed at his pants, his composure cracking. He leaned across the gap. "What are you doing here?" He hissed, his voice trembling with a mix of shock and rage. "You're supposed to be in New Jersey." Audrey picked up a menu. She didn't look at him. "The calamari looks good, doesn't it, Sebastian?" "Exquisite." Sebastian replied, pouring water for her. "Look at me." Richard snapped loud enough that the table next to them turned to look. "Who paid for that dress? Did you spend your entire alimony check on a rental?" Isabella laughed nervously. "It's probably a knockoff, Richie. Ignore her." Audrey finally looked at him. Her eyes were cold. "It's custom Richard. Givenchy. And I didn't pay for it. The future owner of Sterling Global did." Richard froze. "What are you talking about? I am the owner of Sterling Global." For another, Audrey checked her watch, a platinum Cartier tank that Richard had never bought her. 20 minutes. "You're delusional," Richard scoffed, though sweat was beginning to bead on his forehead. "Security, I want this woman removed. She's trespassing." A large security guard stepped forward, looking uncertain. He looked at Sebastian Vane, the billionaire host of the event's biggest competitor. He looked at Audrey, who looked like royalty. "I wouldn't do that," Sebastian said calmly. "Miss Calloway is the newly appointed Chief Strategy Officer of Vane Industries. She is a keynote speaker." Richard's jaw dropped. "She's a housewife. She doesn't know strategy. She types memos." "I wrote your code, Richard," Audrey said. Her voice was level, but it carried. "I wrote the algorithm that made you rich, and tonight I'm going to show everyone the bug I found in it." The lights in the hall dimmed. The spotlight hit the stage. "Ladies and gentlemen," the announcer's voice boomed, "please welcome to the stage, Mr. Richard Sterling." Richard stood up. He buttoned his jacket. He looked at Audrey one last time. "You're bluffing," he sneered. "You have nothing." He walked up the stairs to the podium. The applause was polite but hesitant. The room sensed blood. Audrey leaned over to Sebastian. "Is the file ready?" Sebastian tapped his phone. "Uploaded to the main projector. Trigger it on my signal." Audrey watched her ex-husband take the microphone. He looked small up there. "Showtime," she whispered. Richard gripped the podium. He loved the spotlight, but tonight it felt hot. He looked out at the sea of faces, then down at Audrey in the front row. The red dress was a distraction, a psychological trick. That's all it was. "Friends, colleagues, competitors," Richard began, flashing his practiced smile. "Tonight marks a new era. For too long, the logistics industry has been stagnant, stuck in the past." He gestured vaguely toward Sebastian's table. "But progress waits for no man. It is my great honor to announce that as of 6 p.m. today, Sterling Global has acquired a controlling interest in Vane Industries." There was a gasp in the room. He had said it. It was done. "We have secured the necessary voting shares." Richard continued, his confidence returning. "We will be restructuring the company, streamlining operations, and delivering unprecedented value to our shareholders." Objection. The voice didn't come from the crowd. It came from the speakers. The massive screen behind Richard, which displayed the Sterling Global logo, suddenly flickered. It went black. Then a new image appeared. It was a live stream of a bank terminal, a complicated, ugly interface full of scrolling numbers. "What is this?" Richard turned around, looking at the screen. Technical difficulties cut the feed. "That," a voice, rang out from the front row, "is your liquidity ledger, Richard." Audrey stood up. She didn't need a microphone. She had the room's absolute attention. She walked toward the stage. She didn't climb the stairs. She stood at the base, looking up at him like a judge. "You told the board you bought Vane Industries with cash reserves," Audrey said. "But that screen shows your actual accounts, the accounts you hid in the Cayman Islands, the accounts I set up." "Shut up!" Richard shouted, his voice cracking. "Security, get her out." "Those accounts are empty, Richard," Audrey continued, pointing at the screen. On the giant screen, the numbers were turning red. "Account balance, $0, margin call initiated." The room erupted. Phones were coming out. Traders were calling their desks. "What did you do?" Richard whispered, looking at the screen in horror. "I didn't do anything," Audrey said. "I just triggered the audit clause in the Shell Company Charter, a clause I wrote in 2004. If the debt-to-equity ratio exceeds 10:1, which it did when you tried to buy Vane, the assets are automatically frozen and liquidated to pay creditors." Audrey turned to the audience. "Richard Sterling didn't buy Vane Industries," she announced. "He bet his entire company on a hand he couldn't afford to play, and the House just called his bluff. This is illegal," Richard screamed. "She's hacking me." "It's not hacking if you signed the power of attorney," Audrey said calmly. She reached into her red clutch and pulled out a piece of paper, the paper Richard had forced her to sign yesterday, the release form for the Como house. "You were so eager to get me to sign away the lake house," Audrey said, "that you didn't read the addendum I slipped into the bottom of the stack. You reinstated my executive privileges to the Sterling Trust." Richard's face went grey. He remembered the pile of papers. He remembered throwing them at her. He hadn't read them. He never read the administrative stuff. That was Audrey's job. "You signed your own death warrant, Richard," Audrey said. Suddenly a man in a headset ran onto the stage and whispered in Richard's ear. "Mr. Sterling, the stock, it's crashing. The algorithms, they're dumping everything." "Stop it!" Richard yelled. "Turn off the machines." "We can't," the tech shouted. "It's a hard-coded kill switch. It's dumping the Asian bonds. It's dumping the real estate. It's a fire sale." On the screen, the stock ticker for Sterling Global STGL was in freefall. $140, $98, $45, $12. In 3 minutes, $4 billion of perceived value was wiped out. Isabella, sitting at the table, looked at the screen. She looked at Richard, who was sweating through his suit, screaming at a technician. She looked at the plummeting net worth. She stood up, grabbed her purse, and walked out of the hall without looking back. Richard was left alone on stage. He looked down at Audrey. "You ruined me," he whispered into the hot mic. Everyone heard it. "No, Richard," Audrey said, her voice soft but echoing in the silence. "I just took back the scaffolding, and the building fell down." Sebastian walked up beside Audrey. He took her hand. "Shall we?" he asked. "Yes," Audrey said. "I'm starving." They turned and walked out of the hall, leaving Richard Sterling standing in the wreckage of his own ego, while the flashbulbs went wild. The morning sun over London didn't feel like a new day. It felt like a reckoning. The headlines were screaming before the coffee was even brewed. The Financial Times ran a single stark image on its front page, Richard Sterling, his face pale and sweaty, shouting into a dead microphone, while the screen behind him displayed a balance of 0. The headline was just one word: insolvent. Audrey sat in the private dining room of the Claridge's suite, watching the chaos unfold on BBC News. The reporter was standing outside the Sterling Global Headquarters in New York, where FBI agents were seen carrying out boxes of files. The Securities and Exchange Commission, in cooperation with the UK's Financial Conduct Authority, has frozen all assets related to the Sterling Family Trust. The reporter said, her voice breathless. This comes after a shock revelation at last night's Global Finance Gala, where whistleblowers exposed a decade-long scheme of inflating asset values to secure high-risk loans. Whistleblowers. Plural. Audrey smiled into her tea. It wasn't a team. It was just her, a laptop, and 20 years of being ignored. Sebastian walked in. He was already dressed for a board meeting, looking crisp and energized. He placed a hand on her shoulder, squeezing gently. "How does it feel?" he asked. Audrey looked at the screen as Richard was led out of his Upper East Side townhouse in handcuffs, ducking his head to avoid the cameras. Isabella was nowhere to be seen. "I thought I would feel happy," Audrey admitted, her voice quiet. "I thought I would feel triumphant. But mostly, I just feel relieved. It's like putting down a heavy bag I've been carrying for half my life." "The board wants to meet you," Sebastian said. "Not as my guest, as the chief strategy officer. They saw the algorithms you deployed last night. They realized that while I own the ships, you know how to steer them." "I'm not ready for a board meeting," Audrey hesitated. "I don't have an MBA. I'm a—" "Don't say it!" Sebastian cut her off sternly, pulling out a chair and sitting opposite her. "You are not a waitress. You are not a housewife. You are the woman who just took down a $4 billion Ponzi scheme in under 10 minutes. You have more practical experience in risk management than anyone on Wall Street. You earned your seat, Audrey. Now take it." 6 months later. The Southern District of New York. The courtroom smelled differently this time. It didn't smell like fear. It smelled like polished wood and cold, hard justice. Audrey sat in the back row. She didn't need to be there, but she needed to see the period put at the end of the sentence. Richard Sterling sat at the defense table. He looked unrecognizable. The bespoke Brioni suits were gone, replaced by a standard-issue orange jumpsuit that hung loosely on his frame. He had lost 30 pounds. His hair, without the expensive treatments and dyes, was thinning and grey. He wasn't the master of the universe anymore. He was just a 60-year-old man who had lied to the wrong people. His lawyer, a public defender, who looked overworked and underpaid, was shuffling papers nervously. Linda Kressler, the shark, had dropped Richard as a client the moment his assets were frozen. She didn't work for free, and Richard couldn't even afford a bus ticket. "Mr. Sterling," the judge intoned. It was Judge Halloway, the same judge who had presided over their divorce. The irony was heavy in the air. "The evidence presented by the prosecution is overwhelming. The forensic accounting provided by Vane Industries clearly outlines a systematic intent to defraud investors." Richard didn't look up. He stared at his hands, which were clasped on the table, shaking slightly. "Do you have anything to say before sentencing?" Richard stood up slowly. He turned, scanning the room. He wasn't looking for the press. He was looking for someone else. His eyes landed on the back row. On Audrey. She was wearing a cream-colored cashmere coat, looking radiant and calm. She met his gaze. She didn't smile. She didn't frown. She just watched him, her expression unreadable. Richard opened his mouth, then closed it. Tears welled up in his eyes. His voice cracked. "I got lost." "That is an understatement, Mr. Sterling," Judge Halloway said dryly. "For the charges of wire fraud, securities, fraud, and perjury, I sentence you to 12 years in a federal correctional facility. Restitution to the victims will be paid via the liquidation of all remaining personal assets." The gavel banged. As the bailiffs moved to cuff him, Richard turned fully toward Audrey. "I'm sorry, Aud," he shouted, desperation finally breaking through his shell. "I'm sorry, I didn't know what you were worth." Audrey stood up. She didn't approach him. She simply turned around and walked out of the heavy double doors. She heard him calling her name until the doors clicked shut, cutting off the sound. Outside, on the steps of the courthouse, the air was crisp. Sebastian was waiting by the car, checking his watch. When he saw her, he put his phone away. "Done?" he asked. "Done," Audrey said. Isabella called the office again, Sebastian mentioned as he opened the car door for her. "She's claiming she has information on hidden accounts in Zurich. She wants a deal." "Let the feds handle her," Audrey said, sliding into the leather seat. "She's not part of my story anymore. She was just a symptom of the disease. I'm cured now." 1 year later, Villa Sola Cabbiati, Lake Como. The Italian summer was forgiving. The heat was tempered by the breeze coming off the lake carrying the scent of cypress and lemon. Audrey walked through the gardens of her estate. It wasn't the drafty house Richard had forced her to sell. It was the Villa Sola Cabbiati, a masterpiece of Baroque architecture that she had purchased with her performance bonuses from Vane and Callaway Logistics. She wasn't just an employee, she was a partner. Her name was on the building. She walked to the edge of the terrace, looking down at the water. A private boat was docking. Sebastian stepped off carrying a briefcase and a bottle of vintage wine. He looked tired but happy. The expansion into the Asian markets had been grueling, but under Audrey's strategic guidance, they had outmaneuvered every competitor. He walked up the stone steps, loosening his tie. "The Singapore deal closed," he said, kissing her on the cheek. They folded. "Your prediction about the supply chain bottleneck was accurate to the hour. They had no choice but to sign with us." "I told you," Audrey smiled, taking the wine bottle from him. "Math doesn't lie. People lie. Numbers just tell you the story if you know how to read them." They sat down at a small iron table overlooking the lake as the sun began to set, painting the water in shades of violet and gold. "There's something else," Sebastian said, his demeanor turning serious. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thick envelope. "This came to the office today. It's from the federal penitentiary in Otisville." Audrey looked at the envelope. It had Richard's handwriting on it. It was shaky, jagged. "He's up for a parole hearing in 4 years," Sebastian said. "He wants you to write a character reference. He thinks you still care." Audrey stared at the letter. She thought about the 20 years she spent editing his emails, so he wouldn't look illiterate. She thought about the nights she stayed up nursing him when he was sick, only to be told she was suffocating him. She thought about the way he looked at her in that courtroom when he took her last dollar. She reached out and took the envelope. "Do you want to read it?" Sebastian asked. Audrey looked at the wax seal on the wine bottle. Then she looked at the letter. "No," she said. She didn't tear it up in a dramatic fit of rage. She didn't burn it. She simply set it aside on the far edge of the table, as if it were a piece of junk mail. "It doesn't matter what he says," Audrey said calmly. "He's writing to a woman who doesn't exist anymore. Mrs. Sterling is dead. She died in a courtroom in Manhattan." She turned her gaze to Sebastian, her eyes clear and bright. "I'm Audrey Calloway, and I have a company to run." Sebastian smiled, a genuine, admiring smile that reached his eyes. "That you do. And speaking of which, the architects for the new research facility in Milan are waiting for your approval on the blueprints." "The blueprints," Audrey repeated the word, tasting sweet. "They want to know if we should keep the old foundation or dig a new one," Sebastian asked. Audrey looked out at the horizon where the mountains met the sky. She thought about scaffolding. She thought about how you use it to build something great, and then you take it down so the building can stand on its own. She realized she had never been the scaffolding. She had been the foundation all along. Richard had just built a cheap facade on top of her. Now she was building something real. "Dig a new one," Audrey said firmly. "We're building something that's going to last forever." She poured the wine. They clinked glasses as the sun dipped below the mountains, casting the world in twilight. The letter from Richard sat on the table, unopened, unread, and irrelevant. Audrey took a sip, felt the warmth spread through her, and for the first time in 22 years, she didn't worry about what would happen tomorrow. She had already calculated the variables. She had solved for X, and the answer was freedom. And that is the end of Audrey's journey, from a courtroom defeat that stripped her of her identity to the heights of global success. Audrey proved one undeniable fact. You can steal a woman's money, you can steal her house, but you can never steal her brilliance. Richard Sterling learned too late that when you tear down the person who supports you, you're only ensuring your own collapse. Audrey didn't just get revenge, she got something better. She got a life that was entirely unapologetically hers. If this story satisfied your craving for justice, please hit that like button. It tells YouTube you want more stories like this. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications, so you're the first to hear our next saga of betrayal and redemption. What would you have done with Richard's letter? Would you have read it? Or would you have left it unopened just like Audrey? Let me know in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and stay tuned.